Okay, well, we want to continue our discussion that we had started last time. We should finish that up today. We want to talk about the economy's long-run equilibrium situation. Let me just do a little bit of review here so that you recall what we talked about last time. This stuff is evaporating about as fast as I can get it on there. This is our original equilibrium situation, and we've got a short-run aggregate supply curve. The example we talked about last time is we said, suppose that natural real GDP is, where did I put it? Right here, QN. And if you remember, natural real GDP is equal to GDP, or real GDP, at full employment. And full employment means the unemployment rate is equal to the natural rate of unemployment. Which is, if you remember, the frictional rate plus the structural unemployment rate, no cyclical unemployment or macroeconomic unemployment. Okay, so what, and we've got this thing down here with the unemployment. You remember we had that other axis. We're measuring unemployment, and someplace back here it's 0. But anyway, we would come across here, and if, just to pick out a number, if the natural rate of unemployment's 5%, for example, then we've got a 5% unemployment rate, which corresponds to natural real GDP. And so we see this is full employment, the full employment situation. However, the economy has already reached an equilibrium at a smaller level of real GDP. So we said, oh, if the economy is in equilibrium at a smaller level of real GDP than the natural rate, natural real GDP, then what we have is, what, a high unemployment rate, higher than 5%, okay, right here is 7, 8%, whatever. We've got a high unemployment rate, and we use a term here. We say the economy is in a recessionary gap. What we said would happen is this. If the economy is in a recessionary gap, eventually, it doesn't happen overnight, but eventually the high unemployment rate will cause workers to start, unemployed workers, start going into and saying, hey, I'd be willing to work for a little bit lower wage, please hire me. And there's a lot of competition for each job, long unemployment lines and so forth, and so wages start to go down. And as wages start to go down, what happens is the aggregate supply curve shifts to the right. This is drawn for a wage of W1, and let's just let that be, I don't know, $12 an hour for the typical industrial worker, let's say, non-management worker. And what I'm saying is the high unemployment rate at our first level of real GDP, that high unemployment rate causes wages to be bid down, and they go down and down and down, and finally they're bid down to, let's say, the wage rate equals W2 equals, I don't know, $10 an hour. And that's just something I pulled out of the air. But the point is when the wage rate has shifted, has decreased by that much, the aggregate supply curve will have shifted way over here to the right, and we get a new equilibrium for the economy, a new short-run equilibrium. We've got a lower price level, and our real GDP is now equal to the natural real GDP. And the unemployment rate's now 5%. And so now that the unemployment rate's gone down to this natural level, then the pressure on wages to continue falling, that pressure is gone. There's no further decrease in wages, and so there's no further rightward shift in the aggregate supply curve. It stays where we put it there. We went from an equilibrium at point A to a new equilibrium at point B. And the whole point of this is when the economy is in a recessionary gap, even in the absence of any policy to do anything, the private market economy will go to work the high unemployment rate and wages being bid down, and so things that are taking place in the private economy will automatically solve this problem. It's a slow process perhaps, but it will automatically solve the problem of the recessionary gap and the high unemployment rate. How long does that take to move from point A to point B? And the answer is, there is no general answer every single time, every economy, but I'm thinking that any place 2, 3, 4 years. Could be a little bit less. It depends. If that's a small gap, it could be a year. But the point is it could take a few years, because what we're dealing with is a situation where wages have to fall to make this happen, and people don't just go in, especially the workers who continue to hold their jobs, they don't just go in and say, cut my wage, please. And it's very difficult to get those wages down that much. And so for sure, if an employer's got a contract that lasts, let's say, 3 years, with workers, it says we'll pay you $12 an hour for the next 3 years. For 3 years, those workers are locked in at $12 an hour. And so it's going to be hard to get wages down in that situation. And 3 years is not an unusual period for workers to have a contract that long. Okay? So anyway, it might take 3 years for that contract to expire, and then for a new contract to be signed at $10 an hour. But anyway, this is the process where the economy naturally solves the problem of high unemployment. It's a slow process. What we will do is we'll come back in later chapters and we'll talk about two general policies, monetary policy and fiscal policy. But in general, what happens is we don't wait for this aggregate supply curve to shift to the right through wage cuts. In general, we don't do that. In general, we just say, well, why don't we try to get to natural real GDP by shifting the aggregate demand curve? And so, this is not the time for it, but the point is if we had shifted the aggregate demand curve outward to here, where we intersected the original aggregate supply curve, the short-run aggregate supply, and the new aggregate demand, AD2, if we could do that, this would have been an equilibrium at natural real GDP and the low unemployment rate. And so generally what happens is we don't wait for these wage cuts. Monetary or fiscal policy comes along and shifts the aggregate demand curve. Here's the bad news about that. When we solve this problem through increases in aggregate demand, you saw the price level went way up. We had a lot of inflation. But nevertheless, that's the policy we usually have. As I say, in a later unit of material, we'll come back and talk about monetary and fiscal policy, how they can do these things that we're talking about, restore real, natural real GDP and lower the unemployment rate. Okay, let's go on to the other side of or the other possibility, the other extreme, which is, suppose we have an inflationary gap. Inflationary gap, what we're talking about in this particular case is equilibrium real GDP is greater than natural real GDP. This is very similar to what we started off with before. I've indicated natural real GDP with this vertical curve here. And I've labeled this QN, natural real GDP. And now I've put the unemployment rate down on that unemployment axis down lower at 5%, corresponding to natural real GDP. Okay? Well, the economy will move to whatever point is shown by the intersection, the aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply curve. So at point A, we have the economy in its equilibrium position. Production on the one hand is balanced against spending on the other at this point A, where the aggregate price level is P1, real GDP is Q1. Now maybe we have something like this. The unemployment rate is, what will it be, 4%. There's a lower unemployment rate at this high level of real GDP. You remember real GDP is high, it's higher than natural real GDP. But anyway, as it is, then we have a lower unemployment rate. So when equilibrium, oh here's the equilibrium, Q1. When equilibrium real GDP at Q1 is greater than natural real GDP, we just say, well, there's an inflationary gap. This is also a sign that there is low unemployment. Low unemployment. The unemployment rate is below the natural rate of unemployment. Okay, so what happens now? Well, what happens in the real world may be some policy, but that's not what we're going to talk about right now, but there may be a policy, monetary or fiscal policy, to shift that curve. If there's not, if we just sit back and wait and see what happens, here's what will happen. At the position we start off in, point A, the unemployment rate is 4%. That's a low unemployment rate. There's a lot of pressure on job markets. There's a strong demand. Everybody that wants a job's got a job. I mean, there are people between jobs, but nevertheless, I'm saying if you just say, you know, I've been watching soap operas and taking it easy for a few years, now I think I'll get out and look for a job. You just go out and all of a sudden, there's the job right now. It takes no time to find a job. The unemployment rate's low because there's lots of spending, lots of demand, and so forth for your services. And so the unemployment rate is low during this period that we're coming onto the scene with the inflationary gap. So you find a job quickly. And in fact, maybe the employers are saying, oh man, there's just, you know, the job applicants, they don't have a lot of skills. Everybody with skills, they've got jobs. There's just not much in the way of labor to go around. Okay, so situations like that prevail. And then employers start saying things like this. You know, if I want to hire some really quality workers, even average quality workers, I'm going to have to raise my wage, because if I don't, I'm just going to get these people who are like dropped out of third grade, and that's the only people that come in and apply for a job here. If I want to get people that are, you know, have the necessary skills and so forth, the job market is so tight, I'm going to have to raise my wage. So the employers start raising wages at that point. And if you don't, nobody will apply. And as soon as wages start going up, let me come back and here's the wage rate equals, we'll say now $12 an hour to start with. But as soon as wages start to go up due to this tight job market, some people would say it's a seller's market. Due to the tight job market, higher wages shift that aggregate supply curve to the left. So as the curve starts shifting to the left, it will shift by a little and a little more, but finally it will shift all the way to this point here, SRAS2. That's due to the higher wage. Now the wage rate equals, I'll say, $14 an hour. Does anybody know what the wage rate is for non-supervisory workers, just production workers in the United States? It's about $12 an hour right now. So anyway, we're talking about numbers that are ballpark numbers. If you get all the non-supervisory workers in the United States, I'm saying their average wage would be around $12 an hour. So anyway, if there's a real low unemployment rate, that wage starts going up, and it will finally shift all the way up in this particular case to $14. Then a new equilibrium is restored at point B. Why do I say that's an equilibrium? Because aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply intersect at point B. So the new equilibrium real GDP is QN. And the new unemployment rate is 5%, which we've, in this particular case, said that's the natural rate of unemployment. So guess what happened? We started off at point A, and then we had inflation. Right? The price level went up. We did have an inflationary gap after all, but we had inflation. Wages were going up and companies were raising their prices, and finally we got to a new higher price level, and we got to equilibrium real GDP, and now we are in a long-run equilibrium. Once we've reached this point B, there's no more tendency for wages to rise, because now the unemployment rate's 5%. And that's not an excessively strong labor market. It's just the natural rate of unemployment. There are people looking for jobs, but they're just between jobs. They don't have to be paid more to find it, to take a job, more than their previous job. They're just between jobs. They didn't like where they used to work, or they moved, or something like that. But the point is that in this new situation we've come upon at point B, there's not particularly strong conditions in labor markets, and so wages stop rising. And if they stop rising, we no longer have any more of these shifts in the aggregate supply curve. Questions about this? Now, this is not such a difficult thing from point A to point B. Let me go back and just quickly sketch this thing out that we had before with the unemployment, or the recessionary gap. And I'll just take a second to do it. Qn, Q1, point A, point B. Now let me shift that curve. In the previous case, when we had the recessionary gap, in order for the economy to automatically move us from point A to point B, we had to have wage rates come down. And that was what was shifting this aggregate supply curve to the right. I am saying that this is a difficult thing to do. People will resist that, especially the people who aren't out of work. And if, let's say that you're standing in some line trying to get a job, you're willing to take a wage, let's say that they're paying all the workers $12. You might say, hey, I'm willing to go to work for 10. You might say that. And the other people standing in line may say that. But the people who are inside working, they're not willing to take a pay cut just so you can have a job. And so I'm saying this process is something that it could easily stretch into 3 years for the economy to automatically move from point A to B. Over here, there's not this same natural reluctance for wages to go up. Now there is among employers, but employers will pay higher wages if that's what they have to do to get the workers, because they've got to have workers to basically open the doors and to earn a profit. But the point is that there aren't these as strong institutional forces, natural reluctance that we had a moment ago for wages to fall. Now wages can go up much more easily. And so what I'm saying to you is if we find ourselves in an inflationary gap and there's this low unemployment rate, and wages start going up. Now, I'm not saying it takes 3 years for that to happen. This could happen in a few months. Or at least we'd get on the road moving in that direction. But in a year or two, maybe, whereas before I was saying maybe 3 years, maybe we're talking about, I don't know, 1 to 2 years now, in this particular case, for that adjustment to occur. So our economy, I'm saying there's this asymmetry. Our economy adjusts to a recessionary gap slowly and solves that problem, but slowly, and in an inflationary gap more quickly. And why? Because people will resist their wages being cut much more than they will resist their wages going up. They won't resist that much at all. Employers will resist the wages going up, but the employers are bidding against each other, and they need those employees to open the door, so they're going to pay those higher wages. So it's just a faster process of adjustment. Questions about this? Okay, I want to draw both of these again, but put them together. I shouldn't have erased that. Oh. What's the economy going to do in this particular situation? We're starting off, I'll call this point A. We've got a certain price level, we've got a certain real GDP. Do we have a recessionary gap or an inflationary gap? Or no gap? No gap. Okay, so what's going to happen to wages? Well, the unemployment rate is whatever the natural rate is in this particular case. We've been working with 5%. I don't mind leaving it alone at 5%. The unemployment rate's 5%. I'm saying the job market's not particularly tight in terms of, boy, you just cannot find a worker. And it's not particularly easy in the sense of, boy, there are just workers everywhere trying to get jobs. It's neither one of those. There's just not pressure on wages to move. So if we start off at that point A, we stay there. Now, let's just sort of leave that to the side. I'm not going to erase it because I want it to stay there, but let us start off. If we, let's say this is our original aggregate supply curve. Let's say, forget about the blue curve, but let's just say we start off here at this intersection, this point of short-run aggregate supply curve 2 and the aggregate demand curve. We start off right there. We have a low unemployment rate, maybe 4%. Do we call this an inflationary gap or a recessionary gap? It's an inflationary gap. We're out here at a greater level of GDP, real GDP, than the natural level. There's a very low unemployment rate, and wages are going to rise. Right? And if wages rise, the aggregate supply curve shifts to the left, and we move from point B up to point A. In 1 or 2 years, usually not 3, but possibly. If we start off with this aggregate supply curve, SRAS3, at point C, we find real GDP, Q2. Should have been 3, shouldn't it? I'll go back and fix that. That one will be 2. This one will be 3. I just wanted my subscripts to agree all the way around. If we start off at point C, we have a recessionary gap or an inflationary gap? Recessionary gap, the equilibrium real GDP is below the natural real GDP. The unemployment rate is maybe now, let's say 6%, higher than natural unemployment rate. That being the case, wages will fall. As the wages fall, the aggregate supply curve shifts to the right. We move from point C toward point A. It's hard to get away from that vertical line, isn't it? That natural real GDP. This vertical line, where we keep on coming back to it, it's the intersection between aggregate demand and the vertical line. I'm going to call this LRAS. That's the long-run aggregate supply curve. That is when these job markets, labor markets, are in full equilibrium, meaning the natural rate of unemployment prevails. Long-run aggregate supply, not only do we have a situation where the production of goods and services and the demand for goods and services meet and find an equilibrium price level, but at this point A, the job market is in equilibrium. And there's no tendency for wages to go up, no tendency for wages to go down. We just stay here, and that is why I'm going to call that the long-run aggregate supply curve. Well, we have a few minutes left, and what I thought we'd do is talk a little bit more about long-run aggregate supply. We've just been talking about it a little bit, and if you recall, we kept, no matter where the short-run aggregate supply curve shifted, it would come back to its original position. We would end up with that same level of natural real GDP. I wanted to talk about that same subject, but sort of come at it from a different perspective. This time I wanted to start off by shifting the aggregate demand curve. Let me start off with our standard diagram that we've been working with, real GDP on the horizontal axis and the price level on the vertical axis. We'll start off as before with a short-run aggregate supply curve. I'll label that aggregate demand curve, AD1. Of course, we have a natural real GDP at our equilibrium point, and we'll put in this vertical curve, which we'll see plays a major role. We'll come back to that as we go through our theory here. But that's what we want to talk about really, is this vertical curve. Why is it that we continue to return to natural real GDP over time? Let's start off by shifting the aggregate demand curve. Like I say, we've already been shifting aggregate supply and see how that we work our way back to natural real GDP. So let's sort of take it from a different perspective. Suppose that due to some expansionary monetary policy or fiscal policy or increased exports, but something happens that stimulates aggregate demand, we see the aggregate demand curve shift from 81 to 82. And in the short run, then what we observe is that a new equilibrium for the economy is reached, where the short-run aggregate supply equals the new aggregate demand, and we have a new level of real GDP. I'll label that Q2. What we observe at Q2 is that we have an inflationary gap. Real GDP exceeds natural real GDP. So not only do we have this high level of GDP, but we also have a situation of low unemployment. Why do we have low unemployment? And the answer is pretty simple. If we're going to produce a large level of real GDP, then that means that there are going to be a lot of workers required to do that production. So low unemployment, and with a lag, what will happen is eventually wages will start to go up due to this tight conditions in the labor market. So when wages start to rise, our aggregate supply curve will shift. And if you recall, rising wages cause aggregate supply to shift to the left, or a decrease in aggregate supply, so the curve starts shifting back to the left. How long will that continue for this aggregate supply to decrease? And the answer is as long as wages are going up. And wages will continue rising as long as there's low unemployment. And low unemployment will exist as long as we have that we're at a real GDP level greater than the natural level. So there's a lot of terminology there, but so what I'm saying is, well, we started at some point A, we moved to point B after aggregate demand expanded, and now what we're going to see is how we get back to point C with our long-run equilibrium. So from point B, we have rising wages, the aggregate supply curve starts shifting to the left and more, and finally, the short-run aggregate supply curve will shift back to SRAS 2. And once it's shifted back to the left by that much, then we will have a new equilibrium. Aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply will again be in equality at natural real GDP. At that point, the unemployment rate is returned to a normal level or a natural level. Wages stop rising. And so this point C is a point of new equilibrium. So in effect, what happened? Aggregate demand rose. We had an expansionary impact on the economy, real GDP up, unemployment down, but over the longer run, wages begin rising, and we end up with, at point C, where really all that we have is we've got a much higher price level than we started with at C than at A, but we have no more real GDP and no more employment, no lower unemployment. Of course, this takes a couple, 3 years to make the full transition, but nevertheless, the reason that we're having this discussion is to show how that we continue persistently to come back to natural real GDP, almost regardless of what happens. We can do another one of these. Let me move over here and draw another diagram. But we can do another one where instead of an increase in aggregate demand, we'll let aggregate demand go down and see the effects of that. AD1. SRAS1, we'll start off at this equilibrium point, I'll call it A, okay? Certain price level, P1, natural real GDP. Now, and this is an equilibrium situation, as long as there's no curve shifting, we don't move away from this point A. But now what we'll do is we'll say something happens, for example, a decrease in the money supply, a contractionary fiscal policy, a decrease in United States exports, some other change in autonomous spending could decrease aggregate demand in the economy to AD2. Okay? In the short run, what will happen, and by the short run, in a year or so, we'll move from point A down to a point like B, and that movement from point A to B is caused by the reduction in spending. And so what we observe is this: the price level goes down somewhat, but real GDP declines from the natural level to Q2. When real GDP declines, we need fewer workers to work and fewer other resources, and so now there's a higher unemployment rate, higher unemployment than we observed earlier at natural real GDP. And that higher unemployment rate, with a lag, it takes time for this to occur, but a higher unemployment rate is going to cause wages to decline. So decrease in wages, how quickly? 1, 2, 3 years. But as wages start to decline, that shifts the short-run aggregate supply curve to the right. There's an increase in short-run aggregate supply if wages are going down and resource costs. So short-run aggregate supply shifts to the right, SRAS2, and finally we reach a new equilibrium between the current aggregate demand curve and the new aggregate supply curve. We reach an equilibrium at point C. And at point C, we're back to natural real GDP. The price level's gone down. Now we're down at some point, we could call it price level 3, which is really not what we want to talk about now. We're not focusing so much on the price level. But the point is that even though in the short run, real GDP dipped below the natural level, in the longer run, we move back to natural real GDP. Now, what we saw earlier on in the classroom, we had sort of gone through these same types of exercises, but rather than starting off by shifting aggregate demand, we were shifting the aggregate supply curve. And we found out that even if aggregate supply shifted, that we would come back to this natural real GDP. And now what we've done in these last two diagrams is we've seen that if aggregate demand begins the process and shifts, whether it's an increase in aggregate demand or a decrease in aggregate demand, that nevertheless we move our way back to natural real GDP. And in fact, that's why we call it natural real GDP. It is natural for the economy to reach an equilibrium at that point. This vertical curve, because we're always going to end up at some point on natural real, or on this vertical curve, whether our point A was, wherever our point A was, our beginning point, but we'd end up at a higher point or sometimes a lower point, but always on that vertical curve. This is the long-run aggregate supply curve for the economy. Long-run aggregate supply. And that is the level of real GDP to which the economy tends at any point in time, largely due to these automatic forces. Let me just talk very briefly about this, this long-run aggregate supply curve. It seems to set a constraint for us that even though in the short run real GDP may differ from that amount, we keep coming back to there. What we ought to recognize is that we've seen this concept before, this long-run aggregate supply, which occurs, I guess we could say, is consistent with natural real GDP. That's consistent with something else. It's consistent with our production possibilities curve. I don't even know what all these arrows and diagrams and so forth mean, to tell you the truth, but I'm saying that when we look at these diagrams that we just came through, the long-run aggregate supply curve is a vertical curve, and it is a vertical curve at natural real GDP. So those two concepts go together. And I'm saying to you that our production possibilities frontier that we saw earlier in the semester, where we've got some good X and another good Y, and we can produce a certain amount of X or a certain amount of Y using all of our resources, that production possibilities curve shows our ability to produce goods and services using all available resources and our best technology. Well, that curve, that production possibilities curve, really just corresponds to our long-run aggregate supply, our ability to produce goods and service. So whatever the value of all this X production is, or the Y production when we were using all of our resources, or at some interior point on the curve, whatever the value of our production was there, that's also equal to the value of natural real GDP. The reason I bring that up is we talked about what could cause the production possibilities frontier to shift outward. We talked about how that we could have more resources available, a better technology. We could get rid of some of the rules and regulations that perhaps make the economy less efficient. But those are the types of things, stronger incentives that encourage people to work and invest. Those are the types of things that would shift the production possibilities curve outward. Well, those are also the same kinds of things that would cause this natural real GDP to increase and shift our long-run aggregate supply curve to the right. And so I know I'm throwing a lot of concepts here with you, to you here all at once, but the point is that there are these relationships between the various things that we've talked about as the semester's gone along, And so for you now to come back and understand the long-run aggregate supply curve and what determines natural GDP, those are the kinds of things that we talked about earlier. As I say, the availability of more resources, stronger incentives, regulations that are more, let's say, helpful to the idea of production and business and so forth. New technologies, those things that would increase our production possibilities are also the things that will make natural real GDP increase and the long-run aggregate supply curve increase. So we're not just stuck with one long-run aggregate supply curve, like it or not. We can do something about that, and then later on we'll come back and talk about it, but some of the government's policies of creating stronger incentives, encouraging investment in capital goods and so forth, some of those policies that we have then will make the economy work better and the long-run aggregate supply curve shift to the right. So as I say, we'll come back to that later on. For right now, all you really need to know is that no matter where the aggregate demand curve is, no matter where the aggregate supply curve begins, we'll start off with some equilibrium point that perhaps is away from natural real GDP, but in the final analysis, we're going to work our way back to natural real GDP so that we've got some equilibrium point along this vertical line. Another way of saying that is there's not a whole lot we can do in the long run to get away from this point, that our production possibilities frontier and our technology and so forth sort of determine where we're going to return in the long run, and that our policies basically have, for the most part, a short run effect on pushing us away from this point, but that's where we're bound for in the long run. I think that's a good place to stop. One, to just kind of refresh your ideas, your understanding of all this, and to supplement what we had talked about earlier in the hour. So I guess that's where we'll end for the day, and talking with you later.